What is up, guys, and welcome to the newest edition of 31 on 31, this time titled Creatures of the Night, Vampires and Werewolves. 31 films ranked worst to best. If this is your first time joining us for a 31 on 31, a couple of times a year, me and my cohorts over on Autop Stream, Brian Lomax, CP from Willistredia, and Uncle Sean Chandler, we pick a theme, 31 movies gathered together in that theme that we rank together, and then within the next month or so, we'll all get together in a live stream and discuss the group averages and hash out all of our differences, of which there's going to be a shitload. Even though these are all vampire and werewolf films, the different subgenres within these 31 movies might be the most diverse group of films that we have had yet, and it's going to be the most diverse group of opinions, I can tell you that right now. And this is actually a theme that I think especially me and CP have been toying around with for a couple of years now, really wanting to figure out a way to do it. But the issue that we always ran into is like, yeah, there's some really great original films that we can do with vampires and werewolves, but God, those sequels are dog shit. So what we decided to do this time was that all of us picked 5 movies, and then we left the remaining films up to all of you to vote on some community polls. And so we got some really cool results. We got a lot of engagements. Thank you guys for that. We'll probably do that again in the future with a different theme because I really enjoyed it. Now, as far as this list goes, I am a huge fan of vampire films especially, but also werewolf films, and so the majority of this list I'm really positive on. Really only the bottom 5 are movies that I'm not really too keen on. Everything else is like guilty pleasure all the way up to like 4 or 5-star films. So you might see some of your favorites low on my list. Doesn't mean that I dislike it. It just means that I love something more. So try your best to appreciate our difference of opinion, and I will appreciate you dropping yours down in the comments section below. And one last thing before we get started. As I've said, there are other people doing this, so please, after you're done checking out this video, look in the video description, check out the links for my partners in crime. Go check out Brian Lomax's video as well as Uncle Sean's that are already up if you're watching this live. And later on tonight, hopefully, fingers and toes crossed, CP will get off his ass and get his video done on time for a change.
Step into my office. Why? Because you're fucking fired.
All right, guys, enough of the jibber jabber. Let's kick this bitch off and light this firecracker with 31. And this is a movie that as soon as it was added to this list, I pretty much knew it was going to be 30 or 31 because I have seen it once before, and my rewatch pretty much solidified it as, yeah, no. And that's going to be Twilight. Now, look, Twilight is not an unwatchable film. Twilight is not a dumpster fire. This is a perfectly serviceable romance, teeny bopper little vampire movie. But I despise this movie and this franchise because it basically killed vampire and werewolf films for the better part of 15 years. I mean, ever since Twilight came out and the Twilight saga was like the biggest thing at the time aside from 50 Shades of Grey, actual horror movies starring vampires and werewolves, yeah, fucking non-existent. To the point where I've been sitting here just waiting impatiently for it to come back, and it seems like within the past year or so, we're starting to get that again. And then, of course, they've already announced a fucking reboot of Twilight. You bastards!
And you know why? Because I'm Sparkles, bitch.
But what is this film? It's a teenage romance movie with some vampire stuff thrown in there. Not so much werewolf yet, but you've got Bella and you have Edward. And then you've got, was it Jacob, just kind of hovering around in the background in the friend zone?
When I'm with you, I just feel so safe and secure.
Thanks.
I mean, with him, it's all about my pussy.
Okay.
And besides the fact that this is just not my thing whatsoever, I don't even think as a young teenager I would have enjoyed this. I would have considered this a pussy vampire film. It's just not a very good romance. I don't buy into the chemistry of these two actors. It just baffles me that they were kind of the it couple at the time because I love Robert Pattinson, you know, Pattinson all the way, baby, but I don't think that they really work that well. I think that Bella is an absolutely wooden character with no personality. Kristen Stewart is very good in most things that I've seen her in, but just her performance here for some reason just doesn't really work for me. And so the core romance that this is built off of doesn't work, to where I probably would have been Team Jacob if I continued on in this franchise. But as we all know, nice guys finish last.
He's my platonic friend. I love him like a brother. He's my bud, my platonic friend. Men don't have platonic friends, okay? We just have women we haven't fucked yet.
Coming in at number 30 is going to be Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. And I've seen this film once before. This is actually something where I bought the book, read the book, gave the book to my dad. My dad really enjoyed it. I was looking forward to a film adaptation of this because the book's actually pretty cool. It's a really nice little horror sci-fi kind of revisionist history thing. It's a lot more toned down than this movie, and that's where the problem is. The initial story of just this different version of events of back in the Abraham Lincoln days and the Civil War and all of that, where there's actually vampires kind of at play in the middle of that conflict, and Abraham Lincoln was this closeted vampire hunter before he was president and while he was president. There's some badass shit storytelling wise you can do with that, but this movie decides to put most of that to the side and just focus on gigantic, over the top, horribly CGI'd action sequences, and it just pulls you out every single time. It's not unwatchable, just like Twilight. It's fine. You can almost consider it a guilty pleasure, and I would somewhat agree with you, but there's just so much potential to do a really cool, serious version of this story that they completely fucked up, and I'm still a little bitter about that. Coming in at 29 is most likely going to be the placement that's going to get me the most shit from people, but try to hear me out. Number 29 for me is Dog Soldiers. Now, this is a film that I have actually watched 3 times because I just couldn't understand why I don't see this amazing classic that so many people tell me this movie is. For years, everybody, Dog Soldiers, one of the best werewolf films. Best werewolf film in the past 10 years. One of the best. Maybe Neil Marshall's best. The guy that did The Descent, which is pretty fucking awesome. That is a huge, huge statement. So I tried watching this thing probably 10 years ago. I couldn't get through it. Tried to watch it again maybe 5 years ago. I couldn't get through it. This is the first time that I sat and forced myself to watch the entire film. And guys, it's just not on my wavelength. You know, this is a movie that is very British, and the dialect and the different terminologies that these characters are using, I don't completely understand and roll with, and so the dialogue loses me a lot throughout the film, and that's predominantly the driving force of the movie until like the third act and all the werewolf action comes out. I didn't even realize until I talked with Brian after watching it for the first time fully that I was actually supposed to be laughing at this movie. He was like, yeah, this is one of the best horror comedies ever. I was like, dude, that was supposed to be funny?
That's not funny. That's not funny.
So I attribute this to my misunderstanding or aversion or lack of attachment to British humor. And that's something that has plagued me with quite a few classics that everybody seems to love. So that's as innocent as I can put it. I think the werewolf design is awesome. I think there's some really good gore effects. I think that there is some good action to be entertained by throughout the second half of the film. Story-wise, character-wise, dialogue-wise, doesn't really do a whole lot for me. Even the little twist that they try to pull with the chick that they're hiding out into this cabin with, I'm like, obviously she's one of the werewolf people. What the fuck else would she be doing here? So when they try to surprise you with that, I'm like, yeah, no shit. But overall, it's a movie that I understand why some people love it. It's just not on my wavelength. I just don't get it. Number 28. I love you, Brian. Just remember that. Number 28 is gonna be Ginger Snaps.
This your boy?
Yeah, that's my boy, nigga. We rep the same smart tech.
You just got fucked up with him. Both y'all niggas gonna get clapped up when I get back. Both of y'all niggas.
What did I do?
It don't fucking matter.
Now, just like with Dog Soldiers, this is a movie that I heard so many good things about. Had a lot of people tell me that the whole trilogy, I believe, that their movies are really good, that I already knew walking into it, it was going to be kind of a commentary on menstruation and a girl coming into womanhood and everything. And I was like, that's interesting, kind of playing that into the werewolf thing. That could be cool. And I actually watched this with my wife and my 2 oldest kids, one of which is a teenager, one of which is about to be a teenager. So I got a wide variety of age and opinions whenever we were done watching this film, and none of us really enjoyed it. Now, I do think that Catherine Isabel, the older sister, the one that's going through the transformation, is really good. She's in a lot of other things in that era that I really enjoy, and I enjoyed her character and her character's struggle and journey and all of that. The younger sister, played by the girl who played young Bev in the 1990 It, which is near and dear to my heart, I don't know what was going on with her performance, but I didn't enjoy whatever she did at all. I didn't like her character. I didn't like how her character interacted with people. There was a lot of like bewildered facial expressions throughout the movie that just kind of put me off. And so she's the one you're supposed to side with and sympathize with and go on this journey with and hope that she survives this situation. I just never really got into that because I didn't like her character or the performance whatsoever. The movie does do some interesting things as far as that commentary on womanhood and getting your first period and kind of mirroring that with the lycanthrope virus, if you want to call it that. And I thought that they did an interesting job with that. I would be curious to check out the sequels, although I've heard they're not as good as this one, so that doesn't bode very well for me. But this just wasn't really my thing. I think maybe if I watched it back in the 2000s and I had a little bit more nostalgia for it, I could probably enjoy it a lot more. Watching it in today's context as an adult, and it's a very early 2000s movie, I just think I missed my opportunity to really jump onto the Ginger Snaps train. So, sorry, Werewolf fans, I know I'm breaking your hearts, but just wasn't for me. Number 27 is going to be Brotherhood of the Wolf. Now, I will say, to be fair, this, as well as one more movie on this list, got the rawest deal as far as my experience with it because I had a hellaciously busy May, and so I got very behind. I just watched the last two films for this list yesterday, and today is May 31st when I'm recording this, by the way. See you guys in a couple hours. So I was in a bit of rush mode, and I was just exhausted with vampire and werewolf stuff. And Brotherhood of the Wolf was a 2.5-hour foreign film, which, if you know my taste, is another pretty huge ask of me. So I watched this. I've always been curious of it. At one point, my uncle said this was his favorite film of all time back when it came out, so I was always curious to have it on my radar. And when I watched it, I gotta be honest, I didn't like the first half at all. I was extremely bored. It's a lot of setup. There's a lot of kind of introducing you to this time period, and you have the two main characters that come in to hunt this beast, and there's a lot of kind of brewing romance between a few characters, a lot of time spent in brothels, and I was just like, dude, this is not what I signed up for. The second half of the film picked up significantly. That's where you get a lot of the beast action, that's where you get a lot of the martial arts stuff, you get a lot of the villainous conflict, and I enjoyed the second half significantly more. To the point where I would like to rewatch this movie months down the road in a context where I'm not putting work behind it and I don't feel like I'm being rushed to get through it. But as it stands, my one experience with this film was an experience of two halves. One extremely impatient and bored half, and then the other half pretty well entertained. So this is where it lands when you mix those two together. And now we enter the guilty pleasure segment of this video. The next couple of movies I'm going to talk about on paper are absolute trash. They probably deserve to be lower than a few of the films that I have already talked about, but I have some nostalgia for a few of them. I've always had guilty pleasure with a few of them. And if I'm going purely off of enjoyment factor, I would rather rewatch these films. So fucking sue me. Number 26 is American Werewolf in Paris. Now, I saw this film in the theater when it first came out back in the 90s, and I have always enjoyed it. Its biggest flaw, in my mind, is attaching itself to American Werewolf in London. If this was just a 2000s werewolf film, I think it would have been received a lot better, but because it has that title, people are always comparing it to what most people call the best werewolf film of all time, and it has absolutely no chance in that matchup. So you had the same similar setup here where you have a couple of Americans that go to this foreign land. One of them gets bit. One of them gets killed. There's a romance angle that's kind of driving the main character and keeping him in that foreign land. Where this one differs from American Werewolf in London, aside from the quality, the legacy, the transformation, the special effects, the acting, is that in this one, I actually really like the villainous story that we get here, where there's a group of werewolves that consistently lure Americans into like this nightclub where they can party and be Americans, and then they lock the door. They have this little injection that will actually transform them regardless of the lunar cycle, and then they feast on all these Americans that are away from their land, and nobody's going to miss them, nobody's going to investigate it all that much. I think it's actually a pretty gnarly storyline that actually I wish was better suited in a better film, because that's really cool. I like that concept. That's one of the biggest things that I've always enjoyed about this film. Now, the main character, Thomas Everett Scott, he's somebody that I've enjoyed in other movies more than his performance here. I don't think it's necessarily his fault, it's just the material, but his romance with Julie Delpy, I have some guilty pleasure enjoyment with that. She's much better than he is in that relationship, but I think there's a bit of a cute factor to their two characters, and you kind of root for them to survive this situation, at least I do. And I do enjoy the journey that they go on to kind of take down this group of werewolves that are literally just murdering people in droves. And the elements of American Werewolf in London in here, as far as the comedic side, I actually think this movie is a little bit funnier than American Werewolf in London, but I've never really felt like American Werewolf in London deserved the title of horror comedy. Maybe I'm just weird with that one. But the moments where you are supposed to laugh, where you have the condom balloon and you have the chick from Happy Gilmore like trying to hold her eye in while she's whistling and the other eye pops out and you get the little POV angle, stuff like that, I actually get a good little chuckle out of. So I'm reaching to try to find ways to defend this. The comedy's a little better here. The CGI is where everybody gives this movie shit. And is it deserved? To a degree. I don't think it's the worst CGI of that era by a long shot, so I think that maybe it's a little overblown how bad the CGI is. I genuinely just think it's compared to some of the greatest practical effects ever that literally won an Oscar in American Werewolf in London. But this is a movie that I would never defend, I would never die on a hill for, but I'd be lying if I didn't tell you I enjoyed it. Number 25, another film that is hard to defend and yet so hard for me to hate, and that is Blade Trinity. This is an absolute cliff dive as far as quality from the first two Blade films. But somehow I still kind of enjoy it for all of the different elements here. You had David S. Goyer, who was the writer of the first two films, that got promoted to director. Gigantic mistake. You had Wesley Snipes, that was allegedly getting just way too into the method acting side of Blade, and, you know, there's always going to be a he said, she said element to that. But you have a movie here where essentially Blade is kind of pushed to the side to introduce some more characters so they can do spin-offs. And there's about 5 different plot lines going on with the vampire final solution, human extinction, the final solution to take out all vampires with a viral weapon. You have the day walkers or day stalkers, night stalkers, whatever the fuck that group is. You have the night stalkers introduction and the kind of tail end into their spin-offs, and then you have Dracula. Oh, and by the way, Blade's here. I've always enjoyed Dominic Purcell in a lot of his other stuff. Not the best Dracula by any stretch. Again, it's a lot of what they give him to do, which is not very much, which is why the fuck you would do that to Dracula. I don't know. You have the weirdest cast imaginable. Like, this is seriously an American Pie spinoff with vampires in it. The action's not nearly as well shot or as choreographed. A lot of it's really clunky. There's quite a bit of stunt work here to where Wesley Snipes didn't even show up on camera. Again, kind of playing into that drama. Check out my full review for kind of more details on the crazy behind the scenes production of this film. And by the end of it, it's just not a good third film for this trilogy. It's not a good conclusion, which unfortunately this became for the Wesley Snipes Blade era. It's not really that good of a movie at all. And yet somehow I really enjoy it because it's still Blade action. Wesley Snipes is still cool as fuck in the role. I love Ryan Reynolds as well as Jessica Biel. This is kind of like a prototype for Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool, so I enjoy his humor. I enjoy what he brings to the movie, while the humor's probably dialed up way too much for the tone of what a Blade movie should be. And I kind of enjoy it for all the weird mistakes in casting and behind-the-scenes drama. So this is just one of those films, just like the one that I just got done talking about, that I would never defend, and yet I like it. Number 24 is Van Helsing, and I gotta be honest with you, I didn't realize people despised this movie so much until I joined the internet and started talking about movies on the internet. I've always enjoyed this. On paper, is it the best thing in the world? Absolutely not. It's hokey. It's very derivative of other things. It's kind of bringing in that classic black and white era into the modern age. It's really overly actioned for a horror film. It's not very scary for a horror film. It's not necessarily funny for that kind of family-friendly tone they go for. But yet, I really like a lot of the elements that they bring in here. I love Hugh Jackman in the role of Van Helsing. I've always loved Kate Beckinsale. I think that they have good chemistry as kind of a romantic pair here. I think that bringing in vampires and Dracula and the Wolfman and Frankenstein into one plot is really cool, and I wish we could get more of that stuff. I mean, they tried it with the Dark Universe and completely fucked that up out of the gate. This is a shut your brain off, easy, passable, schlocky, glossy entertainment blockbuster. And it works for me under that context. I enjoyed it in theaters when I was a kid. I've enjoyed it throughout my life. I watched this not too long ago and introduced my kids to it. They had a good time with it. So I think if you walk into this expecting anything serious, you're setting yourself up for failure. If you measure this up to like Stephen Sommers' other film, The Mummy, you're probably setting yourself up for failure. But I have always had a really fun time with this one. And I'll take it a bit further and say that I've always been a bit saddened by the fact this movie didn't succeed more, because I think there could have been a really cool little film series here for Hugh Jackman to do alongside the X-Men films. But I'm on the island with that one. Everybody else hated it. Number 23 is going to be Thirst, another first-time watch for me, and this was the last film that I watched yesterday in preparation for this video. So see my thoughts on Brotherhood of the Wolf as far as this maybe getting a raw deal. But I did enjoy this movie. I still have a very limited experience with foreign films, but I've seen a number of Korean films, so I'm a little bit more used to what they bring. And this is absolutely a classic Korean-style vampire film. It's really unique, it's really interesting, and it's really fucking weird, which makes sense why CP put it into the list. Essentially, you've got this priest where this area that he is in is being plagued by this disease, so he undergoes this experimental little drug to try to cure that. This vaccine, it really fucks him up, and so he gets a blood transfusion, which apparently came from a vampire, and it turns him into a vampire. And the rest of the film is basically exploring this priest losing his humanity, losing his soul throughout the rest of the film as he has to feed on blood, feed on people, lead to murder, and starts to have a huge sexual appetite with the wife of his friend. Naughty, naughty. Pretty sure there's a commandment about that. And so you get the extreme amounts of blood that's classic for Korean cinema. You got some really dark, offbeat humor, which actually worked for me more times than it did not. Some pretty good practical effects here as far as the vampire stuff with, people being thrown and people jumping up into the air and everything. Very convincing. And it was an interesting story. It was different. It was a bit of a love-lust story, which is a classic element for vampires, but the priest kind of pulling back and not wanting to fully become a vampire was the interesting element for me. But it's purely for the weirdness that it's this low on this list, because while I get some dark chuckles out of it, some of it was just a bit extreme. Thanks, by the way, CP, because I was watching this film in my bedroom, and the moment my wife walked in to see what I was watching, they were doing that weird, he was sucking on her toes and she was sucking on his finger, and it was like the weirdest form of 69 I've ever heard of. Or I guess it'd be 11. And then as soon as she sat down, it was just like an entire 30 minutes of just a fuck fest. And I'm like, I swear to God, it's a vampire movie! Number 22 is gonna be What We Do in the Shadows. And I gotta be honest with you, I did enjoy this movie, but I was disappointed because this has always been hyped up. This has always been propped up. There was a TV series done off of it. And, some of it is British humor, but it's a little bit more Americanized, a little bit kind of like the Cornetto trilogy style of humor to me. There's some mockumentary spoof angle here, which is pretty universally funny and universally entertaining if you know a lot about vampire lore, especially within the movies. And so I got some chuckles throughout this, but I never found it to be that laugh out loud funny. I never found the movie to go to a point where it was just really extreme or just the blood or the gore was done to an extremity to be funny. It always kind of felt a little bit more monotone with the level of humor, a little bit more subtle, which again, leaning into that British style of humor, where the American in me was like, go farther! So I had a decent enough time with it, but I didn't find it to be the best horror mockumentary, and I didn't even find this to be anywhere near as good as something like Leslie Vernon, which this is kind of a cousin of, just with slasher films. So it was fine, just overhyped. Number 21 is going to be Bram Stoker's Dracula, and this is the second time that I've seen this film. I watched it way back in the day when I was a kid. It was not a movie for a kid to try and enjoy, especially when I grew up on things like The Lost Boys and Near Dark and From Dusk Till Dawn. Very different vampire film. As an adult, I was really looking forward to getting back into this, bought the 4K Blu-ray, one of the best experience, and I will say this for the film. It's masterfully directed. It is got amazing production value, costume design, that period piece detail. I love the way that they use the lighting and the shadows and the transitions and everything to have this very classic film appeal to it. So as a film nerd, there was a lot of things about this that I really enjoyed. As a vampire fan, I feel like it's so classic that it's kind of bare bones with a lot of the vampire elements. I just like things to be a little bit more bombastic. That's just my taste. So this is going for that more slow, Victorian era romance, giving a little bit more of like a historical angle to what is going on. I mean, this is directed by Francis Ford Coppola. It's the guy that brought the Godfather movies, and nothing but respect to the Godfather movies, but I've always found those to be incredibly slow and just not my type of movie to rewatch very often. This is very much on that pacing level. So while I loved a lot of the technical aspects here, the designs of the creature and the bats and everything, even some of the gore here is really done. Performance-wise, Gary Oldman and Anthony Hopkins and, Winona Ryder I even think does a really good job, but especially Gary Oldman is just absolute standout. It's just not a very rewatchable movie for me. When I'm in the mood for a Dracula movie or a vampire movie, this is not one that I'm often going to be pulling off the shelves, and rewatch value always plays very highly into how I do these rankings. That's just my personal style. And I will say, I'm a huge Keanu Reeves fan, and poor Keanu, he was just miserably miscast in this film. Not just his performance and his dialect and that whole surfer bro kind of accent that he has, trying to bring on this classic dialect. I say, is the castle far? But even in the background in some scenes, I was just laughing my ass off because he just looks absolutely lost. Like there's all this deep, dark shit going on, and he's just kind of standing there like, I don't know what the fuck to do.
Look what your God has done for me.
No, you woman!
Whoa, yeah!
Number 20 is going to be The Howling. Now, more times than not, this seems to be like the silver medal as far as werewolf films go. Most people, from my experience, say American Werewolf in London is the greatest and The Howling is number 2. And I've just never really felt that strongly about this film. This is the third or fourth time that I've watched it, and it's enjoyable. It's got some cool elements to it. I like the initial setup where you have Dee Wallace in this traumatic experience that she had where she was being stalked by this serial killer who, unbeknownst to her, is a werewolf, and she gets sent to this little retreat area to try to kind of reconvene and, reestablish her relationship with her husband, and it's a fucking werewolf coven. So there's a lot of cool elements in the initial setup and the way that the story plays out that makes this unique among the werewolf genre. I think that the werewolf designs are really cool. I actually fucked up in my American Werewolf review where I said that Rick Baker did the design for this werewolf and did the effects for this too. He began the work on it, but then had to leave for American Werewolf in London, and Mr. Bettine, the guy that did The Thing, came in and finished up this movie. And so there's some really good werewolf transformation stuff here, some really good practical work as well. Not quite as good as what Rick Baker did, but also not quite as good as what Bettine did in The Thing, which is, to me, the best of the best. Where the movie doesn't quite work for me is just, honestly, I don't really operate on the comedic wavelength of Joe Dante. Aside from Gremlins, which I love, every other Joe Dante film that I have watched, I just don't really find the humor to be that funny and the mix of horror and humor to be all that effective. And so when he goes for some of the goofier stuff here, like the werewolf sex scene and the really dated animation of the wolves transforming and howling while they're fucking and certain things like that, just it doesn't really come across all that funny to me. It's just kind of dated and awkward. I think that the storyline that we go on with Dee Wallace's character, while I understand the serial killer werewolf's desire to get her to this little coven and do whatever he wants with her, I never really understood the whole point of this gigantic plot with having the psychologist be an in guy and have all these things to try to get them onto this island. I just never really understood what the end goal there was, as many times as I've watched this. I do like the way the movie ends. It's kind of darkly tragic with Dee Wallace transforming on live TV before being shot by the director of Happy Gilmore. But narratively, I've just always found the film to be a bit lacking. Cool effects, cool setup, just not the best follow through in my opinion. Now it needs to be said, from here on up, the next 19 films, I would give every single one of these a 4-star or higher rating if I was reviewing them. So you're gonna see some of your favorites here at 19 or 17 and not anywhere near the top 5. Doesn't mean that I'm shitting on them. It just means that some of these films in the higher end are literally some of my favorite films of all time, and you're not gonna knock those out of the top for me. And with that being said, coming in at number 19 is gonna be Let the Right One In. Now I think it's important to say that I have seen Let Me In a number of times. This is a first time watch of the original Let the Right One In, and so I'm sure that's gonna play into how much I enjoyed this movie quite a bit, because I genuinely love Let Me In, and that was my introduction to this story, and that version of the story is what I am used to, and there are some differences here that, I'll be honest, I didn't enjoy as much, and that's the only reason that it's not quite a bit higher. If we were rating Let Me In, that would be top 10 easy. So Let the Right One In is a tale about this bullied kid that becomes friends with this seemingly vampire girl, and their friendship, their romance starts to kind of give each other what they need, to where the kid wants somebody to actually feel like he belongs with and have his friendship and love reciprocated by, and he seems to get that from her, and she needs somebody to start to be groomed to become her new caretaker. I really enjoy what they do with some of the vampire lore here regarding having to be invited into the house, and how the old man helps her feed by going out and murdering people and like draining them almost like cattle. There's a lot of really cool, unique aspects here to some very classic, tried and true vampire elements. I like the practical effects in this movie. I will say the vampire effects are much better done in this than in Let Me In. Let Me In is much more CGI based. That's my one huge flaw with that film. So that's the one angle where it does have a leg up over the American remake. I think the performances throughout the film are all pretty good. I don't have the attachment to them or the actors the way that I do in Let Me In, but I enjoyed them all. And I do think that there's a dark, tragic element to this film that does make it really unique, to where it's very bleak and it's subtly done, because a lot of the darkest and most fucked up elements of this movie is not really spelled out for you or explained. It's kind of something that you have to read into a little bit. Namely, the sexual orientation of the vampire, which I don't want to get into anything crazy or controversial, but it's part of the story where this is literally a boy who is castrated that now poses as a girl. And you can read into that a number of ways. There's no backstory given. There's no reason to why that person was castrated. There's no context given to whether it was before they were a vampire, after, whatever, what the meaning or the purpose of that was. But you can read into it a certain way, to where this castrated vampire started to pose as a girl to lure people in, to lure in men or boys that are a little bit more needy of a relationship and groom them to be a caretaker. And so that is the much darker element of this original that is definitely not an element of Let Me In, to where you can read this as a straight up romance, to where the sexual orientation of the vampire just doesn't matter to Oscar. Or you can read this as it's quite literally this vicious tale of grooming to bring Oscar in, and using a look of a girl to do that. And that's kind of dark and fucked up. But I honestly prefer the more straightforward romance angle of Let Me In. I prefer the childhood innocence love of that movie, to where those two characters genuinely care for each other, at least seemingly, in my opinion, when I watch it. They care for each other, they give each other what each other needs, and I think that's darkly tragic in its own way, in a way that I enjoy a little bit more. Very good movie. I understand why a lot of people love it. I understand why it's inevitably going to be very high on Brian's list. This was one of his picks, but honestly, I just prefer the American version for a number of reasons. Number 18 is the newest film on this list, and that is Renfield. I just reviewed this like last month, so you could check out my full review, but I really enjoyed this. I was looking forward to checking out just what Nicolas Cage as Dracula was going to turn out to be, and he did not let me down. His performance was so much fun. It felt like he was perfectly cast for this version of Dracula that's a bit of a mix of like Nicolas Cage-isms and the old classic like Bela Lugosi version of Dracula, and my God, was that a beautiful mix. Nicholas Hoult and his journey and his character and his story was really interesting. A movie that does have some social commentary and does have some things to be said about abusive relationships and controlling people and how to break through that, but it's not like beating you over the head with it. It's done really well, to where you can watch this as just a zany horror action comedy and not really care about what is underneath, or you could actually engage with what's underneath, and it balances it really nice. Didn't love Awkwafina's character, but I'm not really just a fan of what she does in movies so far. Hopefully one day I will, but she's 3 for 3 now, where she's kind of one of the weakest elements of the movie for me. But extreme gore, extreme over-the-top action, and extreme over-the-top perfection by Nicolas Cage Dracula. Had a blast with this one. Number 17 is going to be Stakeland. Now, this movie came out during the Dark Ages, also known as the time when the Twilight movies were very popular. And so this was like a complete breath of fresh air for me, where I'm like, oh, a dark, bleak, fucked up vampire movie, thank God. And this is one of those films that I would file under hidden gems, because not a whole lot of people have seen it or talk about it, and it's genuinely one of the most unique vampire movies to me. It's kind of that post-apocalyptic, like Walking Dead era type vampire film, to where where humanity's all been wiped out, vampires roam the earth, and the survivors are kind of moving through just like characters in The Walking Dead trying to avoid the zombies or the vampires it would be in this film. But there's some really extreme gore in here. It is very bleak and unforgiving. I mean, there's literally a scene where a baby is being fed on and then just dropped out of the rafters, which normally would send me into a fit of nausea, but for whatever reason, at the time, I was like, yeah, you fucking kill babies, man. I'm tired of this Twilight shit. The two main characters of the boy and Mr. have really good chemistry. Mr's an absolute badass vampire hunter. There is some really good side characters brought in here. Kelly McGillis shows up at one point. Daniel Harris shows up at one point. And it's a movie that just keeps that dark, bleak, unforgiving tone all the way to the end. And I appreciate a movie that just has no fucks to give about being forgiving or bright or shiny, especially in the era that it came out in. So I dig this one. I think the sequel's actually pretty good too, so please check them out. Well, now we're about halfway through the video, so we're gonna take a quick break, and I have not told the guys in Autop Stream what our theme for October's 31 on 31 is gonna be. So I'm gonna take this moment live in front of you all to call CP and let him know what he's in store for. Hey, what's up? Remember I told you I was going to record me calling you and telling you what October's going to be? It's that time.
Are you out of your fucking mind?
So helpless against what is coming.
So number 16 is going to be 30 Days of Night. I saw this in the theater with my dad, really enjoyed it back then. It's one of those movies that, I'll be honest, I don't really get that engaged with the story, mostly the characters, but I like how unforgiving this movie is. This is vampires in their most animalistic form, where they're just there to fuck people up and suck them dry. Bad choice of words. The initial concept going into this town to where there's 30 days without daylight is really a creepy little kind of a bottle scenario where they have this whole town, but they can't leave the town because of the weather. I like that kind of Alaskan, Antarctic look. It kind of throw back to The Thing vibes. I think snow and isolation work really well with horror. The vampire designs are really cool. I like Josh Hartnett a lot, so it was cool to see him back in a lead role again, and he has pretty good chemistry with the other characters. Where the movie goes by the end of it, I felt like was a little too redundant of Blade 2, but it's a movie I really enjoy, just for the sake of it being just classic, no holds barred, no fucks to give, violent, bloody vampires. Number 15 is going to be Fright Night Part 2, and this is an absolute hidden gem if there is one on this list. Most people don't even know the original Fright Night had a sequel, and those of us that do know can't fucking find it to save our lives. Well, there's actually 2 different copies of it on YouTube to watch, so after this is done, treat yourself. I love the original Fright Night. You have not seen it yet. It's going to be a little while before you see it on this list. And I went a long period of my life without ever checking this out because I usually associate nobody talking about it to it's probably not worth talking about. And it was late last year when I had somebody in, we'll call it my circle of friends, that told me that he absolutely loves this movie, thinks it's a perfect sequel, and so I was motivated to check it out. And all I will say to you, Joey, is that, my friend, you were right. So yeah, I checked this thing out, and this is a damn good sequel to the original Fright Night. This is directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, who gave us Halloween 3 and the It 1990 miniseries, both things that I love, so that excited me even more. And it continues on a story in a really natural way to where through psychiatric treatment, Charlie has now been convinced that every event of the first film is just bullshit. Him and Peter Vincent were tracking a serial killer. The vampire stuff was just like his trauma that he made up in his head. And so it kind of resets the stage for them to go through some of the same events, but they take it in a very different way to where now the vampire is literally seducing Charlie. And you have Peter Vincent, who's kind of more the main character of this one, coming in to save Charlie versus the dynamic that was kind of flipped in the first film. And I think there's some really good creature design here, a good variety. You've got a werewolf, you've got a mute vampire, you've got like this bug-eating ghoul within the little clan of the female vampire. You've got Julie Carmen playing the seductress herself, Regine, and just... And I think as a companion piece to that original film, it's not as good as the original, but I would never walk in with that expectation. It's a really good follow-up. It's a really entertaining movie with some great character motivation, some great character advancement from the first film, some great creature design and practical effects, and it goes for that same fun, classic 80s tone that I love so much about the original. So If you have not seen Fright Night Part 2, which I imagine most of you are, please either pay out the ass for the Blu-ray that's out there in certain markets, or check it out on YouTube later tonight. Number 14 is gonna be Underworld. Now, this franchise is not one to write home about, but I genuinely love the first two films, and I still enjoy the third film, although I can't fucking see most of it. The first film came out in a time where Resident Evil was really big, and so like big, badass, female action horror stars was kind of like the new thing. And I'll be honest, I've always been partial to Celine over Alice in the Resident Evil films. Maybe not a high bar for some of you, but I genuinely get guilty pleasure out of that franchise. I'm sure it'll make it onto the 31 on 31 one of these days. Underworld, pretty good action, some pretty good special effects regarding the werewolf transformations and a lot of the action and everything going on. It is early 2000s action, so there's a lot of slow-mo, there's some CGI in here. It's something that is probably not going to impress you today if you watch it for the first time, but I had a hell of a good time with it back in the day. I thought that it was actually really cool the way that they expanded a lot of the vampire lore with having like some vampire masters that actually cycle out their time of being the head of the clan, and some of them go underground and sleep, and that was a really cool element here. It does have some flaws with being kind of a schlock fest and being a low-hanging fruit type film, but I mean, have you seen where I play some of these films? That's kind of my thing sometimes. So I enjoy Underworld for what it brings. The one element of this movie that has always frustrated me, they spend the whole movie building up how badass Michael Corvin is going to be because he's like a breed of both vampire and werewolf, and he's going to be the most powerful thing. And when he eventually transforms, he gets the shit kicked out of him by the main vampire. It's like, okay, that wasn't that impressive. But beyond that one annoyance, I've always had a good time with this film. I will continue to have a good time, and I will be defending this whenever the debrief comes, because inevitably one of us is going to try to fuck up that average.
A film that is literally unwatchable.
It was you.
Coming in at 13 is going to be the Fright Night remake from 2011, and haters be damned, this is a damn good remake. This is one of the best remakes in my opinion. Again, is it as good or better than the original? No, but I don't walk in with that expectation. If you walk in with that expectation with any remake, you are setting yourself up for a gigantic bitch fest whenever you get home. When I walk in to a remake, what I expect is, do they pay respect and tribute to the original while doing something fresh or modern or unique with that original material? And to me, Fright Night does that very well. It's got the same setup, it's got the same core elements of the character motivations and the overall struggle that they go through, but it's modernized, and they swap up a lot of the character dynamics with having Charlie actually be kind of a cool kid and being at odds with Evil Ed and having a bit of a guilt in regards to the fate of that character. And the romance between him and Amy is a little bit different as well. You've got his mother in here at a very different placement within this story, where the first film she's absolutely helpless, and this one she's actually trying to help them kick the shit out of the vampire. Colin Farrell, if you're gonna get somebody to try to do what Chris Sarandon did and be that really cool, kind of sexy, seducing kind of vampire, I think he does a fucking awesome job. I love Colin Farrell, and I think he does a great job as Jerry here. There's some really solid humor throughout this film. It is a little bit more of a modern type humor than the horror comedy angle of the original film, but I think it's well done. I really, really enjoy David Tennant's version of Peter Vincent. Is it as good as Roddy McDowall? No, didn't say that it was, but I enjoy how different it is. He's kind of more the Chris Angel thing. He's got a little bit more of a fraud angle to him and a guilt angle that brings him in at the end. And I enjoy what David Tennant brings the few times that I've seen him, like this and Jessica Jones. So there's not really a whole lot of flaws with this movie that I have, aside from the fact that it's just not quite as good as the original. The one thing I will say is that I don't think that McLovin's version of Evil Dead is very good. Now, I don't know if that's because he doesn't get enough screen time, doesn't get enough material to actually do his thing with, but he kind of goes for that McLovin humor where it works in Superbad. I don't think it necessarily works for Evil Ed. So he's the one angle here where I'm like, yeah, that's a significant drop off from the original film. Number 12 is gonna be Interview with the Vampire. How many people had that Mandela effect and thought that this was titled Interview with a Vampire? I sure as shit did. Interview with the Vampire is a film that I've seen a number of times throughout my life, but it's been quite a while since I've seen it. And so I was really looking forward to checking this thing out. And as far as kind of the more classical approach to vampire films between this and Bram Stoker's Dracula, obviously, I really prefer what this film does. I think the two lead performances here are outstanding, especially Tom Cruise. His version of Lestat is just a riot. He just chews the scenery throughout the entire film and is a blast. I think that Brad Pitt does really good as kind of the more sad and somber vampire that doesn't want to have this life. I think that the introduction of Kirsten Dunst here, I believe this was her first role, she is fantastic. She just matches the acting caliber of Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, two of the best actors ever in this film, so that's nothing but credit to her. And just like with Bram Stoker's Dracula, the period piece detail, the production design, the costume design, it's all immaculate here. This is like a Pride and Prejudice type movie with vampire stuff going on. Where the movie fell apart for me a little bit is that it feels like it would be better suited for a TV series. I actually believe they did do a TV series off of this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a really solid story here about two vampires throughout centuries, and it feels like certain elements of the story they kind of had to fast forward through because this has to be a feature-length film and not a 6 to 8 hour television series. And so I think the first half of the film has a really nice pace to it. Once you get to the segment where Kirsten Dunst brings in a woman to be bitten to be like her mother, from that moment to the end, I swear it feels like the movie's on fast forward because she turns and then they're kidnapped and then they're killed and then Brad Pitt does his revenge. It montages with voiceover all the time that Brad Pitt's character is by himself, and then it loops back around to present day with Christian Slater, and then Lestat comes back and then the credits roll with that absolutely atrocious Guns N' Roses cover of Rolling Stone's Sympathy for the Devil. So I really enjoyed this film up until like the last 30 minutes or so, which it's still enjoyable, but it just feels like, God, you guys didn't let that segment breathe at all. So I would be curious, if I'm correct that this was a TV series, please let me know if it is everything that I'm asking and if I should check it out. But purely for Tom Cruise's performance alone, almost, this is pretty high on the list, but as a different period piece, Victorian era type vampire film, I have a lot of fun with this story. Number 11 is gonna be An American Werewolf in London, and I already know everybody's screaming at me. 11!
Jesus Christ! Without a dream.
Please check out my full review for this movie for all of my thoughts. I love a lot of elements of this. I think that the transformation, the practical effects, the way that they do the commentary on survivor's guilt, and they kind of embody that through the undead characters, really cool stuff. The movie has never been one of my absolute favorites of all time, despite most people calling this like the godfather of werewolf films. And a lot of that's just because of the story. I don't think that the story is all that intriguing or interesting because the characters don't really have a whole lot to do here. They get bit, the guy moves in with the nurse that just wants to fuck him, and then for whatever reason she puts up with all his crazy bullshit, and then they go that really bleak route as far as just, yeah, he's not getting away happily. And as I hinted at in American Werewolf in Paris, this has always been dubbed as a horror comedy, and either I don't get the comedy or I just don't find the comedy that funny. It just doesn't, the horror comedy title never really made sense for me for this one. So if that's what you're going for, which being the director is John Landis would make sense that he would try to throw some comedy in there, that entire section of the film falls flat for me. All the werewolf stuff, the gore, transformation, top notch, some of the best, if not the best ever made. Everything else, good, just not my favorite. Coming in at number 10, a movie that I'm sure some people are gonna highly disagree being above American Werewolf in London, and that is Teen Wolf.
Give me a keg of beer.
Most of my placement for this movie is nostalgia. This has always been one of my favorite horror comedies. This has always been a movie that I have really enjoyed. I'm a massive Michael J. Fox fan, and especially the more we go and just you see the tragedy of how Michael J. Fox's life has turned out regarding his illness, and we just had that documentary come out, which I don't know if I have the strength to watch just yet, but this, Back to the Future, Doc Hollywood, some of my favorite Michael J. Fox films, I just have this attachment to it because I love that actor so much. But I really enjoy this. Is it a little low budget and cheap in aspects? Absolutely, but that's kind of the part of the charm of this one. I think the characters are fun. I think that the message that it has about never being afraid to be yourself, and the way that he learns that lesson through all the different kind of high school cliches of wanting the hot chick, but the chick that's actually really good for you is right there and you don't even fucking see her, and the best friend that's trying to kind of exploit the whole thing that even kind of learns a little bit throughout the movie about not exploiting his best friend for financial profit. And it's just a good movie. It's a really enjoyable classic 80s flick that I've always had a good time with. I mean, I watch this probably once a year. It always puts a smile on my face. It's one of those comfort movies. It's like the movie equivalent of a bowl of hot soup and a blanket on a winter day, and just, I really enjoy it. And while I probably should have attempted this when I was younger, there has always been a desire to do a handstand on top of a moving van because of this film. Don't do that at home, kids. Number 9 is gonna be Daybreakers, and this is a movie that I don't really hear too many people talking about, but when it came out, I saw it and I was like, this is one of the best vampire movies I've seen in a very long time. And it continues to be. I was excited to rewatch it, and it's still fucking awesome. You got Ethan Hawke in here, you've got Willem Dafoe, Sam Neill, an outstanding cast, and essentially this is going the post-apocalyptic route as well, but more futuristic, a little bit more almost cyberpunkish to a very mild degree, to where vampires are the main race of the earth now, and humans are just surviving in little pockets, and blood is quite literally running dry. And so you have Ethan Hawke here as somebody that works with blood, trying to come up with some kind of a blood alternative, and then he comes across this group of survivors, these vampire hunters that have found a cure for vampirism. And so it's kind of like a Last Samurai, Fern Gully, Avatar type setup, to where he's part of one side and then kind of gets indoctrinated into this other side and takes the fight to the side that he used to be sided with. And it's just done in a really cool way. Really extreme gore here, which I love. Really good performances. The way that they kind of modify some of the classic vampire lore here, with vampires looking like humans as long as they have a steady supply of blood. And if they start to starve for that blood, they turn into more the bat monstrous type of vampires. Really cool stuff. And even just a little bit of commentary they have here on like big corporations and society, where you got the vampires that are going out to like these little Starbucks and everything, and they keep having these signs to where the coffee is now 15% blood instead of 20%. Now it's dropped down to 10%, and it's just really cool and unique. And the Spearig brothers are absolutely people to check out their filmography, because another movie by them, Predestination with Ethan Hawke, one of my favorite time travel movies. These guys got a really cool style, just haven't done too many movies. Daybreakers, absolutely one of my favorites on this list. Number 8 is gonna be Silver Bullet, and more times than not, this absolutely is my favorite werewolf film of all time. While it definitely cannot hold a candle to the effects or the transformation of American Werewolf in London, what I love and I attach to Silver Bullet for is the story and the characters. And that's always what I go to a movie for first. Having a young 80s Corey Haim here and a young Gary Busey is something that just, it's very nostalgic for me. I love both those actors, especially Corey Haim, another guy with a totally tragic life that just makes me attach myself to some of his earlier work so much more. But having this disabled kid with a not very good relationship with his sister, and a bit of a strained relationship with his uncle in regards to how his mom views the relationship. The family drama in this movie is really engaging to me, and where their character arcs go by the end of this about bringing them all closer together, I really enjoy that ride we go along. And I think this has a very classic horror take, where they have the werewolf kind of obscured a bit more throughout most of the film. It's kind of like the Jaws shark approach. And I actually think it works really well at building tension and kind of building that intrigue. And it's got that classic Stephen King flavor to it, because this is based off of one of his early novellas. So all the different ingredients here, I think, make a really solid, enjoyable werewolf film that I have buckets of nostalgia for, and much like Teen Wolf, is just like kind of a comfort movie to me. Even though it's much darker, much bloodier, and much bleaker in certain aspects, I get comfort from this film. Where the movie certainly has a couple of issues, when you get the reveal of the identity of the werewolf, there is some explanation that this character gives to why he is killing some of the people in town. And one of them is really intriguing as far as his religious placement, to where he's like, I killed this person because they were going to commit suicide and their soul was going to be eternally damned, and I saved them from that by killing them before they could kill themselves. And you're like, that's really dark and fucked up, but that makes sense why somebody in that position would maybe think that way. That's weird. Why'd you kill the rest of the people? Just cuz. And so if they had followed through with that kind of religious motivation, I think that would have been really cool. But they just kind of assign it to one person, and the rest of it is just, oh, he's just fucking evil, killing people. The other flaw, which is the easiest shot to take at this movie, and it's absolutely deserved, is that werewolf design is fucked up. Number 7 is going to be John Carpenter's Vampires, and most people would tell you the last great John Carpenter film was In the Mouth of Madness, and I would respectfully disagree and say that it was John Carpenter's Vampires. I've always loved this movie. I think it has such a cool style to it. It has that classic kind of simplistic approach that Carpenter's best stuff has, but there's a lot of attitude in this movie. There's some really solid gore, some really cool fun characters, and the cast I've always really enjoyed. James Woods as Jack Crow is in competition for one other character I have not talked about yet for coolest character in a vampire movie ever. I just love his attitude. I love his fucking sick sense of humor, this very anti-PC sense of humor, and it just comes across very entertaining, especially delivered by James Woods, who just has a good natural attitude towards him. I love the fact that we get Thomas Ian Griffith in here as the head vampire. I think he's actually really creepy and very intimidating as the main villain of this film. Always loved him ever since the Karate Kid days. Now a lot of us are getting reintroduced to him through Cobra Kai, but I've always loved his version of this character, his version of a vampire in Valak. I think that the whole vampire hunting team and their whole method of madness to where they pull people out using the crossbows and burn them in the sunlight is just a really cool, unique thing. And then setting it to where the entire team dies in the first 30 minutes of the movie, and now it's just two of them kind of on the run, taking on the biggest, most badass vampire. It sets a lot of good tension in place. So I've always enjoyed this. Does it have a little bit of a lower budget feel to it? Absolutely. Is it stacked up against some of John Carpenter's best films? Probably not, but it's fucking awesome. Number 6 is going to be Near Dark. Along with John Carpenter's Vampires in a lot of ways, these two movies are like vampire westerns, and this one is the better of the two for sure. Now, Near Dark takes a really simplistic approach to the vampire stuff. They never say vampire, they never spell out the rules, you just kind of get introduced to it throughout the entire movie. And it's all in the backdrop of a classic love story, where you get this cowboy that has an attraction to this mysterious girl, she bites him, and now he gets brought into this group of vampires to where they're kind of trying to bring him into the fold, to see if he's got what it takes to live this life of debauchery and murder that they do every single night. Lance Henriksen in here is awesome. You got Bill Paxton in arguably his best role. I mean, he is just lighting up every single scene, chewing the scenery, one of the most fun vampire characters in Severin. And the way that they incorporate that Western element is really cool. And I like the way that, again, subtly, they do all the vampire lore, to where they drive around in this vehicle where it's all tinfoiled up except for the little visor for them to see through. They're always covered in blankets. They hunt at night. There's certain rules as far as how they can feed off of each other to keep each other alive. That's pretty much what Caleb does throughout most of the film because he doesn't want to kill anybody. And I even like the way that they subtly incorporate some American history into here. Like Lance Henriksen has a line that more or less confirms he was bit in the Civil War. You've got a reference to the Chicago fire, like alluding to they're the ones that started the fire. And it's just a really cool, slick movie. Catherine Bigelow has gone on to be one of the most successful directors of all time. My favorite film of hers is Point Break, but my second favorite is easily Near Dark. Number 5 is going to be From Dusk Till Dawn, and this is a film that has always been one of my favorites. Now, admittedly, as I've gotten older, I've likened the first half of this film, kind of the more Tarantino crime thriller side of it, more than the actual vampire stuff. When I was a kid, it was flopped, but this has always been a really solid, enjoyable movie that I just love the characters here. I love the script by Tarantino. Robert Rodriguez has always had a really cool eye for directing and style here. And I just like the mashup. I like the way that it's two different films that just suddenly mash into each other. I watched this with my wife and gave her no context to what we were watching. And when suddenly it was vampire, she was like, oh, what the fuck? George Clooney's character of Seth Gecko might be the coolest character in movie history. Like him and Jack Crow are easily the two coolest characters, along with Blade. So 3 characters. 3 characters in this list that are bad motherfuckers. I think that Quentin Tarantino actually gives a really good creepy performance. Harvey Keitel's storyline about a preacher who has lost his faith and then regains it through this horrific experience is a really solid story arc to go through.
So which are you? Are you a faithless preacher? Or are you a mean motherfucking servant of God?
And I think that a lot of the vampire action and gore is done really well. Where the movie falters a bit is it gets really goofy in the back half. Some of that early 90s CGI, even some of the practical effects and the vampire design is very hokey and cartoonish in certain spots. And so that's where it gets a little too campy for my taste. But I can usually shove that to the side and just have a really good time with this film. Especially now that I'm an adult watching it. My dad took me to the theater to see this when I was 6 years old, not realizing how adult it was going to be, and woo, that was a fun time.
All right, pussy, 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 come on in, pussy lovers. We got white pussy, black pussy.
Number 4 is gonna be the original Blade, one of my favorite comic book films of all time, and for a long time I didn't realize it was a comic book film. Blade, absolutely badass character. Wesley Snipes is this character. I mean, he is up there with Hugh Jackman as Wolverine and Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man and a few others that are just born to play that role. The action side of things is awesome. It still holds up really well. I like the way that they incorporate a lot of the vampire lore here and do things a bit differently. Whistler is a great side character and I love their dynamic. This is just genuinely a kick-ass movie if you like horror and action mixed together, and there's few movies that have done it better. The only thing holding this one back from what is going to be my next choice is that the CGI in this is not good. It's not the worst of the era, but certainly ain't the best. Number 3, Blade 2, always been my favorite of the Blade movies. Takes everything I love about the original Blade, does it a little bit better, with the exception of the CGI. CGI is still shitty, just in a different way. I love the Reaper vampires, the little fucking mouth opening up. That shit's really creepy to me, really unique. It kind of made vampires scary again. Some really solid action. I love Blade having to work with the vampires, and you get Ron Perlman and some of those character actors that just make that so much fun, and their rivalry with each other. Norman Reedus, really good side character. A bit lazy and a bit thoughtless with the way that they bring Whistler back, but having Whistler back is awesome, so that's easily forgiven. But overall, if you want horror and you want action, I mean, you can't go wrong with either Blade film, but to me, this one has always been one of the best of that subgenre. Coming in at number 2 is gonna be Fright Night. I mean, did you guys really have any doubts what my number 1 was gonna be? I mean, hello? Number 2 is Fright Night, is one of the best vampire movies ever made. One of the best movies of the 80s. It's so enjoyable. It's got such a cool and fun style that is so 80s that it never ages.
You don't have to be afraid of me. All you have to do is take my hand.
And they even work in a little bit of that nostalgia for like the old Hammer film era, like when you have the Peter Vincent and the black and white old school telethon vampire shows. Like it brings in both of those eras and makes both of them cool in different ways. Characters are awesome here. Charlie's a great character. Peter Vincent, one of the best characters in vampire movies, especially with this one and Fright Night Part 2 put together. Chris Sarandon, he might be my favorite vampire of all time, is Jerry Dandridge. Like, he's just cool as fuck. Everything that you want in a vampire villain, that coolness, that confidence, that kind of seductive sexiness, that everything, all the elements that guy brings is so awesome. I had the pleasure of meeting him 2 years ago at MegaCon, got a picture signed for my dad. He was an absolute pleasure to meet. And this has just continued to be one of those movies brought to you by the great Tom Holland that just never seems to age. There's just so many things about this that should age poorly that never does. All of the old school practical effects and some of the goofiness and that horror comedy tone. And this is the movie in this list that best balances that horror and comedy tone, in my opinion. It's just an endlessly rewatchable film. I love it. I will always love it. But coming in at number 1 is a film that for the longest time, I always said this was my favorite horror film. This and John Carpenter's The Thing constantly battle it out.
So did I enjoy it? Yeah. Was it interesting? Yeah. Do I fully understand it being your favorite movie? No.
I grew up watching this on VHS constantly. It's one of those tapes that I'm surprised didn't just bust off the spools as many times as I rewound it and replayed it. I love the style of this film. Just like with Fright Night, it has that 80s cool that never ages. There's something that is so appealing about like that teenager nightlife that they have here with the leather jackets and the motorbikes and fucking Kiefer Sutherland's hair, which should be ridiculous, but is like the coolest hair ever. You have this really good brother dynamic between Michael and Sam that I've always latched into pretty well because it reminds me of me and one of my younger brothers and just the way that we kind of had to endure a lot of stuff when we were younger. And the vampire villains here from David all the way up to the final reveal of the master vampire. Really good vampire designs to where they're fun, but they are genuinely creepy and intimidating. A good amount of blood. It's a movie that holds on to all the horror elements, but has fun along the way, but just never loses that balance. With Fright Night, this one just balances those tones so well. Soundtrack is incredible. There's nothing about this movie I don't like. To me, this is basically a perfect film. It's one of those movies that I will always love, I will always cherish. It's basically a part of me with how much I enjoy The Lost Boys. So I knew when we were doing this list, this was gonna be my number one, no matter what the fuck the other 30 movies were. And I'm true to my word, because ain't nobody dethroning The Lost Boys ever. This is my number one vampire movie. Well, that does it for this edition of 31 on 31, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. Please check out the other guys' videos in the video description. You got Brian, you got Sean, you got CP. And as always, like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future. And remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.